I am very pleased to announce that David Dylan Thomas has been speaking at LavaCon for years, advocating fighting bias with content strategy, and it is needed now more than ever. And I'm happy to do a shameless plug that David's book on fighting bias with content strategy is now out. He's going to talk to us now on that very topic and then lead a panel discussion immediately after. So may I welcome David Dylan Thomas.
All right, everybody see my deck, I hope.
Yes, sir.
Thank you all for having me, and Jack, I love your jacket. This is Fight Bias with Content Strategy using mental shortcuts for good instead of evil. We can certainly talk about how to use them for evil, but I feel like we're pretty good at that already. So my name is David Dylan Thomas. I'm a content strategy advocate at the experience design firm Think Company, and I'm also the author of Design for Cognitive Bias, out now from a book apart. The road to this book began with a podcast I do called the Cognitive Bias Podcast. The road to the podcast began with this woman. Her name is Iris Bonnet, and she gave a talk at South by Southwest many years ago called Gender Equality by Design. Amazing talk, highly recommend you look it up. And part of the point was that a lot of implicit gender and racial bias comes back to pattern recognition. And imagine that you're hiring a web developer, and the image that might pop into your head unbidden might be skinny white guy. And it's not because you actually believe that men are any better at programming than women, far from it, but over the course of your life, there's been a pattern established through movies, television, offices you've worked in that makes web developer kind of equal skinny white guy. So if you see a name at the top of a resume that doesn't quite match that, start to give that resume the side eye. Now, when I saw that something as evil as implicit racial and gender bias could come back to something as simple and, dare I say, human as pattern recognition, I decided I need to learn everything I possibly can about cognitive bias. So I did. This is the Rational Wiki page of cognitive biases. There's well over 100 here, and I took one look at this and realized I am not going to figure this out in a day. So I took one a day, and then would move on to the next one the next day. And this turned me into the guy who wouldn't shut up about cognitive bias. And so eventually my friends were like, Dave, please just get a podcast. Now, it's worth establishing from the jump what is cognitive bias. And at the end of the day, it's really just a set of shortcuts your mind is taking just to get through the day. Now, every day you have to make something like 1 trillion decisions. Even right now, I'm making decisions about where to look, how fast to talk, what to do with my hands, right? If I thought carefully about every single one of those decisions, I'd never get anything done. So it's actually a good thing that for the most part, our lives are run on autopilot. But the autopilot sometimes gets it wrong, and we call those errors cognitive biases. Here's a really common one. It's called confirmation bias. And the way it plays out is you have an idea in your head and you really only look for evidence to support that idea. And if you ever see anything that doesn't support the idea, you say fake news and you move on. Now, a really powerful example of this came during the Iraq War. The whole idea was we needed to go into Iraq because Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction and we need to get him before he gets us. It was very compelling. As it turns out, not so much with weapons of mass destruction. Within a year, the president of the United States, the very one who had said that there were weapons of mass destruction, said, no, we didn't find anything. Still, people believed that there were weapons of mass destruction. There's so much so that 14 years later, over 50% of Republicans and over 30% of Democrats believed that, yes, there were in fact weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. We're going to come back to this bias. Now, these biases are very hard to fight. Part of the problem is you may not even realize you've got the bias, right? There's literally a bias called the bias blind spot where you think you don't have any biases, but you're sure everybody else does. Part of the problem is about 95% of cognition happens below the level of conscious thought. You're making these decisions so quickly, you don't even realize you've made them. So the next time somebody asks you why you did something, the most honest answer you can give is, how the hell should I know? Even if you know about the bias, you probably still do it. So there's a bias called anchoring. And the way it works is I can ask everybody at this conference to write down the last 2 numbers of their phone number. And then I could say, we're going to bid on a bottle of wine. Those of you who wrote down a lower number are going to bid lower. Those of you who wrote down a higher number are going to bid higher. It's called anchoring. It's a thing. Here's the thing. I could tell you all of that before I run the experiment and tell you not to do it, and you'd still do it. In fact, I could say, I will pay you cash money not to bid this way. Still do it. Now, the good news is that there are content design choices we can make to either mitigate some of these biases or maybe even use them for good. So let's go back to that skinny white guy. So in experiment after experiment, if you have two identical resumes and the only difference is the name at the top of the resume, if it's a male-dominated field, male name's going to keep going, female name stays on the pile. But here's the thing. Why do you need that information? What about the name is helping you, the hiring manager, figure out who to hire? Think of it like a signal to noise problem, right? The signal, the thing that's actually helping you make the decision are the qualifications, the experience. The thing that might actually be getting in the way is the gender or the race or whatever you're reading into the name in terms of gender and race. Now, City of Philadelphia did in fact do a round of anonymized hiring for a web developer position. And they discovered that the best way to anonymize a resume is to physically print it out and have somebody take a marker and redact it like a CIA document. The other thing they found is that if they found a resume they liked, they would naturally want to go to the GitHub profile of that developer to kind of see their portfolio. But the second they got to GitHub, all the personal information was there and it ruined the experiment. So clever people that they are, they wrote a Chrome plugin that would then anonymize all that information as it loaded. And then just to complete the circle, they took that code and put it back on GitHub, and it's there now if you ever want to try this yourself. Now, another really important bias to understand is cognitive fluency. And this is the idea that if you're looking at something and it looks like it's going to be easy to read, you'll assume whatever it's talking about is also easy to do. By the same token, if you see something and it looks like it's going to be hard to read, you'll assume whatever it's talking about is also hard to do. Now, I love pancakes. I've been making a lot of pancakes lately. And this is a recipe for pancakes. And the text is kind of small and clumped together. And I might glance at that and think, I bet pancakes are kind of hard to make. I don't know if I'm going to make pancakes. Now, you take the same content and add really big full width imagery and little bursts of text. I might take a look at that and say, you know what? I bet pancakes aren't that hard. I bet I'm going to make pancakes. A 2-minute video, forget about it. We're making pancakes. Now, think about the decision to drive versus public transportation, right? If I take a look at this printed schedule to get from here to downtown Philadelphia, I will look at that and say, oh no, public transportation is impossible. I'm going to drive. I look at that app screen. And again, before I read a word, I might think, I bet public transportation isn't that hard. I'll give it a shot. Now, I can't see all your faces, so I'm just going to ask you to vote in your hearts. How many of you think that Rosa Parks was born in 1912? Okay, how many of you think that Rosa Parks was born in 1914? You're both wrong. She was born in 1913. But the point is, most people usually vote for 1914 because if something is easier to read, we actually think it's more true. But it gets worse. If something rhymes, we actually think it's more true. And this has consequences. Now, what's happening is that we like things that are easy to process. I've looked at bias after bias, and they're all in one way or another a shortcut to certainty, right? We love certainty, we hate uncertainty. And things that are easy to process feel more certain. I'll give you an example. If I asked you, hey, what did you get for your 5th birthday? You got a toy truck, right? You might think, I don't know, that's kind of hard to remember. It's kind of hard to process. I'm not very certain about that answer. If, on the other hand, I ask you, hey, what'd you have for breakfast this morning, right? That image would pop right into your head. It'd be very certain. It's easy to remember. It's easy to process. Feel certain. Things that rhyme are easier to remember, easier to process, feel more certain. Things that have big, clear fonts and pictograms are easier to process. They feel more certain. Now, this becomes important when we think about things people need to believe. Now, there's a crisis in this country where African Americans generally do not believe health information that comes from the government. If you look at this 2002 survey, when presented with a statement, the government usually tells the truth about major health issues like HIV/AIDS, only 37% of African Americans actually agree with that statement. By the time you get to 2016, that number has dropped to 18%. Now, we could do a whole other talk about why there are legit reasons African Americans have concerns about health information coming from the government, but the fact remains this is information that could save lives. So if it needs to rhyme, if it needs to use plain language and pictograms, so be it. Now, when I first put this in the book, my editor kind of challenged me and said, okay, this is a cool idea, but can you actually, show me this in practice? And I'm glad she pushed me on it because I had found some really interesting examples. So this was a study where you had women who were smoking while they were pregnant. And when they were presented with material written at the 3rd grade reading level, right, easier to process, they were more likely to achieve abstinence from smoking during pregnancy and 6 weeks postpartum. Similarly, when you had caregivers who were helping other people take medication, when they had a plain language pictogram-based intervention, you saw decreased medication dosing errors and improved adherence. Now, you might be thinking, okay, Dave, that's great for plain language and pictograms, but rhyming, really, can that help? Let's talk about click it or ticket. So not too long ago, there was this legislation rolled out in a whole bunch of states that basically said, if you don't wear your seatbelt, you can get a ticket. Now, the legislation on its own actually did a bit of good, right? Especially among older drivers, but not as much with younger drivers. So they rolled out click it or ticket, and the results were that national belt use among young men and women aged 16 to 24 moved from 65% to 72% and 73% to 80% respectively. Now, just to put that in human terms, for every percentage point you go up in people buckling their seatbelt, about 270 lives are saved. So if you do the math, that's roughly 4,000 lives saved, in part through rhyming. It's silly, but it works. Now, I want to talk about our cognitive biases because these are the ones that can really get our users in trouble. So I told you we'd come back to this. For a long time, I had a misconception of what the scientific method really was. I thought it was, I have an idea about how the world works, and I'm going to test that idea. And if I'm right, I'm going to write down what I did, and a whole bunch of other people are going to try it. And if they get the same result, yay, that's a new law. Let's write that down and move on. After talking to some real scientists, I found out it's a little more complicated than that. The way it works is I have an idea about how the world works, and I'm going to try it out. And if I get a good result, I'll write down what I did, and a whole bunch of other people try that. And if they get the same result, I get to spend the rest of forever trying to prove myself wrong. I have to ask myself, if I'm wrong, what else might be true? Okay, let me go and try and prove that, which is a much more rigorous approach and was invented specifically to fight confirmation bias. Now, as content practitioners, it is very easy for us to leave more elegant solutions on the table because we fall in love with our first idea. Let me show you how easy. So let's say we're going to play a game with a computer, and the computer is going to give us these numbers and that question mark and say, put whatever number you want where the question mark is, and I'll tell you if that number fits the pattern. Put in as many numbers as you like, and when you are ready, tell me what you think the pattern is. Now, if you're like me, you start out with 8, and the computer says, congratulations, that fits the pattern. Would you like to try another number? And if you're like me, you say, no, I got this. The pattern is even numbers. And the computer says no. And the reason it says no is because I never tried this. The pattern is not even numbers. The pattern is simply every number is higher than the number that came before, which is a more elegant solution, probably easier to code, probably cheaper for your client. But I never got there because I was so in love with my even numbers idea. Now, there are tools out there to help us avoid that outcome. One of them is called red team, blue team. And the idea is that you have a blue team who does the initial research and maybe gets as far as a wireframe, but before they really go too far, you have a red team who comes in for one day. And their job is to go to war with the blue team and to look for every hidden bias, every more elegant solution, every potential cause of harm that the blue team missed because they were so in love with their initial idea. Now, I like this approach because it's fairly economical. I don't have to tell my boss, hey, from now on, we got to hire 2 teams for every single project and we got to check each other's work every day. I need one team for one day to make it a little less likely that we're going to put something harmful out into the world. Another good tool for this is called speculative design. And it's this idea, it's kind of like Black Mirror, right? Which, if you haven't seen it, is a show where you take some near future technology and you talk about how would it play out if it were put in the hands of real human beings. And the answer is almost always horrible. In fact, I think anybody working on a new technology by law should have to write a Black Mirror episode first. But this is a real job. A company called Superflux went down to the United Arab Emirates to help them figure out the future of energy. And the question on the table was, should we continue down the road of fossil fuels, or should we investigate renewables? So what Superflux did was they figured out, what is the air quality going to be like if you keep doing fossil fuels, maybe 5 years from now, 10 years from now. And they didn't just figure it out, they bottled it. And by the time you get to about 10 years out, it is unbreathable. By the end of that engagement, the UAE announced they are going to invest $150 billion in renewables. Now, I want to close by talking about déformation professionnelle. Told you I speak French. And it's a bias where you see the whole world through the lens of your job, which in the workaholic society we live in might seem like a good idea until it's not. The paparazzi who ran Princess Di off the road probably thought they were doing a good job, and technically speaking, they were. They were getting a really difficult to get photographs that was going to fetch them a very high price. What they weren't doing such a great job at was being human beings. Now, the former police commissioner of Philadelphia, when he got the job, asked his officers, "What do you think your job is?" Many of them would say, "To enforce the law." And he would say, "That makes sense, but what if I were to tell you your job is to protect civil rights?" Now, that encompasses enforcing the law, but it's a bigger job. It's a harder job because it requires you to treat people with dignity. This slide, by the way, has been here since 2017. And obviously, recently, it has become more visible. And personally, I get much more emotional than I used to when I get to this slide. But I keep it in here because now more than ever, it's clear how we define our jobs can be a matter of life and death. Now, he was telling his officers, your jobs are harder than you think. And I'm telling us, our jobs are harder than we think. It isn't just to create great documentation. We have to define our jobs in a way that allows us to be more human to each other. Now, people are already working on this. You have the Design Ethics Booklet, which is a first do no harm Hippocratic oath for designers. You have the Design Justice Network, which has an amazing set of principles and is doing amazing work in this area. And it's a lot about the difference between user-centered design and shareholder-centered design, as Erica Hall puts it. We often think we're doing the former when in fact we're doing the latter. There's the Tarot Cards of Tech, which is another great little intervention for this. And you go to the site and you see these cards and you click on them and they flip over and give you these really provocative questions about the design you're working on. How might cultural habits change how your product is used? And how might your products change cultural habits? If Facebook had asked itself this before it launched, we might see a very different world today. There's also software engineers getting into this with things like the Never Again Pledge, where data scientists vow not to use their powers to hurt marginalized communities like immigrants. And you see that kind of collective action play out at organizations like Google, where there was Project Maven, a battlefield AI, where software engineers said, we don't really want to work on this. And if you make us, we're going to leave. And Google backed down. They walked away from a $250 million military contract and then turned right around and did Dragonfly, which is censored search in China. The battle goes on. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. Now, this wasn't some software guru at a TED Talk. This is Martin Luther King. 50 years ago, he saw this, and it's only more true today. So the challenge I will leave us with is, how might we define our jobs in a way that allows us to be more human to each other? Thank you.
Okay, so David, stay online. So I chatted the Tarot Cards of Tech in both the chat window just now and in the takeaways on the Slack window. So thank you for that. It's amazing what's been around for years that we just weren't talking about. So I thank you for that. And it's interesting that those of us who are in content, I know that Kendall Sparks did a workshop this weekend on how we can use our superpowers as content creators to advocate change. He focused on climate change, but we could just as easily do equal rights change and safety. So right now, we are going to continue this conversation about, let me back up. I live in Los Angeles, and the Hollywood machine has been getting a lot of introspection lately about how they can become more diverse and what is the value of having a diverse cinema machine. And I assert the exact same thing comes to developing content in our organization. So David's about to do a panel discussion on the necessity of diversity and inclusion in content development teams, and I'll let your panelists introduce themselves.